This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest this episode, Stephen Tao, author of London, Reign Over Me, How England's Capital Built Classic Rock. It all started in London, more than 50 years ago. A generation of teens created something that would change the face of music forever. London, Reign Over Me immerses us in the backroom clubs, basement record shops, and late-night faint radio signals of 1960s Britain, where young hopefuls like Peter Frampton, Davies, and Mick Jagger built off of American blues and jazz to form a whole new sound. Author Stephen Tao weaves together original interviews with over 90 musicians and movers and shakers of the time to uncover the uniquely British story of classic rock's birth. Capturing the stark contrast of bursting artistic energy with the blitzkrieg landscape left over from World War II, London, Reign Over Me reveals why classic rock and roll could only have been born in London. A new sound from a new generation, this music helped spark the most important cultural transformation of the 20th century. Tao features interviews with a long list of artists, including John Anderson, Rick Wakeman, and Steve Howe of Yes, Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull, Rod Argent of the Zombies, Dave Davies of the Kinks, Spencer Davis, Peter Frampton, Roger Glover of Deep Purple, Manfred Mann, Dave Mason, John Mayall, Kenny Jones and Ian McLagan of The Small Faces, Greg Lake and Carl Palmer of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Paul Rogers, among many, many more. Stephen teaches history at Delaware Valley University, specializing in rock and roll and 20th century America. He's the author of The Strangest Tribe, How a Group of Seattle Rock Bands Invented Grunge, and resides near Philadelphia with his wife, daughter, and 2 dogs. To hear a playlist of the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. And one last note before we get to the interview. This was recorded the night before the news broke of the death of Rolling Stones drummer Charlie Watts. He was 80 years old. Charlie passed away peacefully early Tuesday morning, surrounded by his family at a London hospital. Rolling Stone magazine appropriately called him the band's irreplaceable heartbeat. Rest in peace, Charlie Watts. Stephen, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
It's great to have you here. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, basically, because I'm just to give you an idea, I'm 58. I think I'm 58. I forget if I was 58 or 59, somewhere around there. But basically, I was like 7, I guess, when the Beatles broke up. So a lot of that stuff that happened, that what we now call the classic rock era, happened when I was too young to experience it firsthand. So my sister, who's like 9 years older, would tell me stories about, getting Sgt. Pepper's right when it came out and having her mind blown kind of thing. So my formative years, like high school, let's say, was late 70s. And by that time, the mainstream had kind of gotten stale. I mean, there was a lot of good stuff, but I was like in the suburban high school that really wasn't exposed to it. So it was sort of leftovers of The Who and Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd. And it was okay, but it was nothing really special. And then the 80s happened and the MTV thing. And that wasn't, I didn't get that. My roommates were all talking about the videos. Nobody was talking about the music anymore. It was all about the presentation. So it was in the 80s. I think it was one of my roommate's girlfriends. She said, here, she gave me a copy of Quadrophenia by The Who. And, I'd heard The Who before, obviously, but never that. I listened to that and I was like, wow. And I just sort of delved into The Who and the Beatles and the Stones and all of that. And that I just was discovering the 60s 20 years late. So when the whole Seattle grunge thing, Nirvana thing blew up in the early 90s, that was like my 60s, and I ended up writing about it. My first book was about where the grunge thing came from, called The Strangest Tribe. So for my second book, I decided to go back and kind of my own roots and explore London as a scene like I did Seattle. Like, where did that come from and why, and how did all this great music sort of happen at this particular point in time?
I wonder if we'll ever see that again. You talked about the 90s. That was an amazing time, that period where Nirvana and Pearl Jam came out, and we haven't experienced anything since then. Will we ever have anything like that again?
Well, I'd hope so. I mean, there's always music scenes. It's such a different world now, of course, but there's so much talent out there, young people that are incredibly talented musicians making great music. It's not necessarily publicized. And I think it's because partly, the internet and anybody can kind of make music in their bedroom and have it sound good. But the problem is that everybody else can do that. So it's sort of flooded. So you have to find it. I don't know whether we're going to see an explosion, a revolution like we did, let's say, with grunge, or before that, with London and San Francisco and all those great places.
It was a great period. And there's an excellent foreword by drummer Bill Bruford of Yes, King Crimson, Roy Harper, Genesis, among others. And as he points out in that foreword, what was so special about being a musician in London in the early 60s was that they could play anything they wanted. And one line that really stood out, he writes, quote, "More than people making things happen, it seemed rather as if things were happening to us at breathtaking speed, and we just better be ready." So eloquently written, and from reading the book, so true of those days.
Yeah, I mean, Bill's a terrific writer, and I was very thrilled that he was willing to write the foreword. It just seemed like for them, it was a ride. They were along for the ride. They kind of, didn't know exactly what it was that was happening because they were in the moment. But on the other hand, they knew something was up, and that this was a moment to take advantage, and that there are opportunities out there to make music and actually, make money doing it, and enjoy yourself and experiment and be creative.
How did it come to be that you got Bill to do the foreword, and also a long list of artists here that you spoke with? Peter Frampton, Spencer Davis, Dave Davies, Rod Argent, Ian Anderson, John Anderson, a lot of guys from Yes, John Anderson, Rick Wakeman, Steve Howe. The list goes on. Dave Mason. How did that all come together? Paul Rodgers, too, one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah, I mean, well, Bill is kind of a funny story because Bill is, if you know him, he's very educated and super serious kind of a person. Really nice, but very serious. And he's not going to just like give out interviews just without knowing that there's some legitimacy to it. So, he kind of, what's your premise? And I went through all these things. He said, all right, fine. I said, look, I'm going to be in London such and such date back in 13, I think. And he says, okay, we met at a coffee shop to do the interview. And it was in this town called Guildford. Guildford is about a 30-minute train ride from London. So, I got to Waterloo Station plenty of time, ready to catch that train. I spilled coffee on myself, so I knew things were already going to go bad. And then I got on the train to Guildford, and it was, I think, something like a 10:30 interview, 10:30 in the morning. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, wow, it's getting awfully close to 10:30, and we're really nowhere near Guildford. And then I realized I was on the local train, and I was about to blow this interview. And so I'm frantic. I'm texting him. I'm calling him. I'm emailing him. Nothing. Finally, we pull up to the station. 20 minutes late, my phone rings. Bill, hello, Stephen. Are you coming? Fortunately, he waited, and so when it came time for the forward, I thought of a few prominent names, and then all of a sudden, it's got to be Bill Bruford if he's willing to do it, of course, because that just made total sense to me, and he, of course, he was willing to do it. But yeah, some of the other folks, I mean, it was just persistence, not too obnoxious persistence, but persistence. And sometimes, I got lucky with people like Paul Rodgers and Peter Frampton and Ian Anderson and whatnot. And sometimes it didn't work out, but yeah, for the most part, I think I got a lot of the interviews I was trying to get.
Did you make the trip to London and to England to do these interviews, or were you already there? Because you are a Pennsylvania guy. Are you born and raised in Pennsylvania?
Yes, yeah, I am. I did most of the interviews remotely, okay. I went to England most of the time. I did do a handful of interviews in person there, but most of that time was spent researching, going through the old music weeklies, and that's what I'd spend all day doing, and then at night go out with friends to the pubs and whatnot. So it was a good time. Oh,
that's cool. So did you check out some of the venues in the area that some of the bands played in back in the day?
I did. I mean, it's almost like it reminded me of Seattle a little bit, because if you go to Seattle, like very few of the venues that existed at the time of the grunge thing are there anymore. And it's similar with London. There's very few. The Bag of Nails is there, and the 100 Club. There's a few that are still there, but most of them, you just go there and it's a bank, and there might be a plaque that said, McCartney met Linda Eastman here in 1967 or something, and there might be a picture of Mick Jagger as a young man or something like that. But yeah, so I just kind of got a feel for where at least these places were, and a layout of the place. And like one of the things I write about in the book is about Eel Pie Island, of course, which was a big club in the 50s and 60s into the 70s. So I took a trip out there and describe it in the book. But that was just, again, to get a feel for what was it like and where is it in location of London, so I could write about it better.
That is my favorite part of the book, the Eel Pie Island. I want to get to that and ask you about that a little bit later on. Your book sets out to highlight London's contribution to the era of classic rock. And in the introduction, you ask Americans a question. Why do we neglect our own rich musical history, notably our distinguished black artists? Why do you think that is?
Well, part of it is because there was, at least back then, there was, radio was segregated here, so white people listened to white radio, and you might get a couple of black crossover artists like a Fats Domino or Little Richard in the '50s, but mostly it's white artists, and the black folks listened to black stations. So that was a big chunk of it. But I just think Americans, I mean, not to diss my own country or whatever, but are just tend to be sort of, I would say ignorant, but kind of like just not, it boggles my mind that Americans, like, let's say when I mentioned, let's say David Letterman, that he didn't know who Sonny Boy Williamson was. I mean, before interviewing Jimmy Page, I mean, I just think that he should have known some of these people, and Howlin' Wolf, some of them were prominent, John Lee Hooker, and Americans don't take the time to really learn that. I mean, even some of the British people tried to educate us. Eric Clapton, he's been taking some heat lately for the anti-vaxxer thing, but he tried to help introduce people to B.B. King, for example, and some of our artists that, we really need to appreciate because that's where it came from. I asked my students, I say, these are young kids. They're 18, 19, 20-year-olds. I'm like, how many people have heard of Led Zeppelin and Rolling Stones? They're all raising their hands. How about, Big Bill Broonzy or even Muddy Waters? Very few of them know who Muddy Waters is. So it's just something that I think Americans should be educated in, but unfortunately aren't.
Yeah, the artists from London in the early 60s, they had a love and appreciation for these artists. Robert Johnson, Sonny Boy Williamson, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, and as you point out, British kids growing up after World War II, they faced some difficult times. I remember the story Keith Richards told of the 1944 Nazi bomb raids over London. Keith and his mom barely got out of their home in time. They came home to find some of their neighbors had been killed. So right. As fans of the blues know, the childhood of artists like Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, and many more, they all grew up during difficult times, slavery, poverty. That really resonated with the youth in London. Mike Pinder of the Moody Blues, he had a great quote in your book. He said, like black musicians, his generation experienced war and the deprivation that war brings. So they really understood the basis for the blues, and they really identified with it.
Yeah, I think it was a combination of that and the fact that the music that they got, for the most part, because the BBC wouldn't play anything like that. And so, when they started to hear blues, it was so alive. And so it's a combination, I think, of the deprivation, not just during the war, but growing up after the war that they experienced. Combine that with the excitement and the depth of this music, and they were just drawn to it.
And it was quite an escape. These weren't spoiled rich kids. These were kids growing up in some rough areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them, like we read Pete Townshend's book, they talk about, like having outhouses and things like that, like having a washing machine that didn't exist. Everything was very primitive compared to American standards, and they had rationing in England after the war until like 1954. So some kids like, wow, what's a banana? What's that? But it depends who you ask too, because some of them were like, you know what, it wasn't so bad in the 50s because we weren't like starving, and we had what we needed, and we made it the best of it. So, but yeah, it certainly they didn't have the luxuries that at least white Americans had.
The name Chris Barber, that's not one classic rock fans and fans of the blues are familiar with. Who is Chris Barber, and why is he so important to the origins of British blues?
Chris Barber actually just passed away maybe 6 months ago. And what a wonderful interview. And I interviewed him twice, actually, probably for maybe 2 hours, I guess, total or something like that. A wonderful guy. Memory really sharp, remembers stuff from the 40s that's dead on accurate, things like that. But Chris Barber was a sort of a gem that he's the ground zero, all of it, really. It all started with him. He had Alexis Corner in his jazz band. He's never a rock guy. He was a jazz trombonist. But Alexis Corner, basically, if people know anything about British blues, they know he was sort of the guy that started the blues in England. He recorded Rock Island Line with Lonnie Donegan, which started the whole skiffle craze in England in the 50s, which everybody was in a skiffle band. It was like you didn't have any money, so you could have these homemade instruments, and people like Jimmy Page and John Lennon and all these famous people later, Ray Davies from the Kinks, were in skiffle bands. It was him. He started the Marquee Club where everybody played, and so he did so many things, and he brought all these people over, like Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Muddy Waters and Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, all these all these incredible American musicians, and exposed a lot of British, not just kids, but all ages, to all this talent.
I'm trying to remember if it's in your book, but was Ginger Baker a fan of Chris Barber? Because Ginger was a big jazz guy.
Oh, I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. And Ginger Baker was just, I mean, that was one of the things that I discovered as I was going through, just the amount of jazz background that a number of those drummers had, the British drummers. You don't even think about people like Baker or Charlie Watts or Ian Pace of Deep Purple as examples. And that gave them a swing that I think a lot of the American rock drummers didn't have. And it's funny that I was just reading something about, one of those ridiculous lists, greatest drummers of all time, And actually, no, it wasn't. It was a Howard Stern thing. They were talking about this, and I think he was interviewing Lars Ulrich from Metallica, and he had mentioned Ian Pace, and I thought, well, thanks for mentioning him, because nobody talks about him, but
no.
Man, listen to him swing, even on Smoke on the Water, but listen to him swing on that, and I think that really brought something to the table.
Charlie Watts, I was bummed to hear he's not going to be part of these upcoming dates for the Stones. I don't know. Personally, that makes a big difference to me. Without Charlie, what are the Stones?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just it's again, people don't think of it, but the Stones don't sound like the Stones without him. And just using space, timing, it was just everything.
Deep Purple bassist Roger Glover tells you about being a kid living above a pub in London's Earl's Court neighborhood, creeping down the stairs in his pajamas to the pub to hear the skiffle bands playing. You mentioned skiffle. Can you talk about skiffle music and its importance to the eventual classic rock era?
Very important. And so basically in the 50s, 1956 into 57, you had a hit by Lonnie Donegan with Chris Barber's band called Rock Island Line. Now, it's a Lead Belly song that they covered, and it just inspired this skiffle boom. And really what it is just kids that didn't have any money, which they didn't, and you could have a band you could probably get an old guitar somewhere, and you had a singer, of course, and then you just, for your drums, you just use like a thimble and your mom's thimble and washboard. Again, no wash machines, and you use that for your percussion. And then you'd have, for your bass, they'd make a bass out of a tea chest, with a broom pole and a string, and now you have a band. And so it was enormous, because so many kids, it's almost like punk rock before there was punk rock. Like, I think one of the ideals of punk rock is that anybody can do it. You don't have to be educated at Juilliard. You don't have a ton of money, and just do it. And that's what everybody was doing that. And that really started a lot of things. And then eventually, things started to pick up in the 60s. They could graduate to, rock and roll bands.
Is there a good example of skiffle music, of the original skiffle music, that people can listen to get a good idea? Is there a particular artist?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Lonnie Donegan had a number of hits on that. Well, he was kind of the leading star, so Cumberland Gap and Rock Island Line are a couple of the big ones. But it's just there's actually an old record, American record, called Hometown Skiffle, goes back to like 1929, I think, that has all these type of skiffle songs that inspired those kids too. You could check out.
Good place to start. Yeah. Let's get to Eel Pie Island, a mini island on the River Thames. And as I said, this is my favorite part of the book. As you write, this in some ways birthed what we now call classic rock. It was an oasis from the grim reality of post-war life. The Stones played there, The Who, Pink Floyd, Rod Stewart, the Yardbirds, David Bowie, who was then known as David Jones. And you quote a guy by the name of David Snelling, who was a young fan at the time. He had a great story about seeing the members of the Rolling Stones looking like something out of the Stone Age. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, I think just in general, the feeling about Eel Pie Island was, as you mentioned, it was a break for people, because for kids, and there was this new class of individual called the teenager that didn't exist in England before. You were a kid, and now if you're a boy, now you're working in the plant with your dad. And that's where you work till you die. And all of a sudden, we didn't really talk much about the art schools, but there's like a little bit of a break in there. And so there was this guy, Arthur Chisnell, that saw this teenage class, and he created this out of this old broken down hotel. And on Eel Pie Island, he created this club, and it was a place for all these kids to go. And you could kind of just be yourself. And I think with David Snelling was an example. There's people that went there and he thought, well, you're going to have to go get dressed up. And he saw the Stones were sort of dressed very casually. And he was like, maybe I ought to do that, And so that kind of, it was just it was a kind of an oasis, like you said, especially 50s into the 60s. It changed a little later on, but there weren't a lot of drugs or anything. People, these people were smoking pot, things like that. But mostly it was just, cheap beer and people just having a good time and seeing, all these artists you mentioned, plus American artists, that came over. And John Lee Hooker is an example that played there. And it was such a weird place because it had this little bridge to get there. And
I was going to say, it wasn't an easy place to get to, right?
No. And over the River Thames, and you'd have to, this little bridge and this little rickety bridge. And like John Steele from the Animals was telling me, that's in the book, and talks about how you had little carts and they would get all their stuff over. It was a big pain in the ass, the drums and all the amps and everything. And they'd set everything up and then wheel it all back. And, but it was just a weird place. And it was like, it sounded like amazing. And you had these spring loaded floors so you could just jump way high into the air and drink, Newcastle Brown Ale and enjoy the band. And so, yeah, it really was an incubation period for a lot of those bands that ended up becoming huge.
It's still there at Eel Pie Island.
Yeah, there's, I don't know what it's like now. It's been a few years, but when I was there, it's a bunch of apartments. There's nothing anywhere indicating that anything happened there. There was a hotel, and then in that hotel was this club, but there's anything there that indicates anything happened. It's similar with the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, which is another sort of outlier of London, where the Stones got started, and the Yardbirds. There's nothing there other than a little, a plaque.
It looks pretty small, too. It's almost like Gilligan's Island.
Yeah, it's just a tiny island in the middle of Thames, but it was an adventure, for people. And like I mentioned, there's a little old lady that would take your tuppence or whatever, and you go across, and then and you go into the club. And I think Snelling, he was such, the way he describes it was so, he was just basically painting with the words, about, the smells and the smell of the water and a little bit of marijuana and it was just kind of like I think San Francisco before San Francisco existed,
And David Snelling just a fan, or is he a musician?
Yeah.
How did you come about? How did you meet him? How did that all come together to get his quotes?
He's just a fan. That there's a group of people that got together that formed this Eel Pie Island club that were all fans, and I got in touch with them and I interviewed several of them, and he was one of them. And they were all these really super nice people, some of which I met. One of whom gave me a tour of London, and so yeah, they were. It was really cool to get their perspective of things because, and I can't remember if it was him or whoever was talking. So yeah, we'd have these conversations with, Keith Richards about what's blues and what's rock and roll, and and it was no big deal. And of course, they weren't famous yet. So, but I guess, like my wife says, I'm always interested in the birth of things, and so I'm just fascinated people are talking to.
Oh, absolutely.
Rolling Stones. It's not like you got to go through all these managers and media. And
yeah, they were just hanging out with the folks who were at the show, smoking a cigarette outside the venue, and just shooting the shit, as they say. Just talking with the fans. And nowadays you couldn't do that without getting through a series of bodyguards and backstage passes and you name it. The Black American musicians, you write, were treated with reverence when they came to the UK. Topham, the guitarist of the Yardbirds, told you about going to a blues festival, and the artists were so taken aback by it, they were visibly nervous. It was very strange for them to see.
Yeah, and you have to remember, this is the 1950s and 1960s, and here in America, of course, we're going through the civil rights movement, and there's the kind of the backlash against that. So, not that it was ever easy to be a Black American. Certainly back then, it was especially difficult. And for some of them coming over to England, it was a completely, there was always prejudice everywhere, but it was definitely, they were much further ahead in that department than we were, and so they got treated with reverence, like you said, and some of the artists were like, wow, wait a minute, I'm having a meal with a white person in their home. That's weird. That doesn't happen. And so things that we don't even think about now, to them was very strange,
I want to talk now about art school. because we want to get to this because this is important too. It's amazing how many times you read in a bio about a classic rock band or an artist from the UK. And sure enough, they went to art school. Art school was an important place for these artists. They developed a serious creation. They met like-minded souls. And I often wondered why so many of them went to art school, but the answer is pretty simple. After grammar school, you either work in a factory like your dad or go to art school for free.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, it's like it's so different than America, but with the Labour government in England, you no longer had to, there was like a mandatory military service that went away. So you have all these kids growing up, and all of a sudden this option opened up that didn't exist. And so they were like, well, yeah, like you said, you can go to work in a factory with my dad, and maybe you go to art school for a couple of years. And a lot of them didn't really know what they were going to do. And some of them weren't even really artists, but it didn't matter. And they met, the Pete Townsends and the Ray Davies and Claptons and Sandy Denny and all these musicians. And they ended up kind of like just, well, you're kind of weird, I'm kind of weird, and let's just compare notes. And then it's just sort of sprung eventually from there, to start bands. And I think it sort of inspired each other. They inspired each other creatively, and that's going to be reflected in the music coming up.
I could almost picture them in the classrooms just messing around with designs, logos for their band. And yeah, that's cool. The Rolling Stones helped put the blues on the map, of course. It all began with the famous story of Mick Jagger, Keith Richards. They're sharing the blues records on the train to school. But Brian Jones plays a big part in the early Stones blues records. Talk about Brian Jones, his importance to the Rolling Stones, and that whole era of UK rock in the early to mid-'60s.
I think Brian Jones is an example too, and this is one of the things that I really discovered is how much these people lived at such an early age. Like he's like 21, he's already got a kid, and he's already like lived a pretty rough life at this point. And so he was like very rooted in the blues, particularly Elmore James. He was a huge Elmore James fan. He played slide guitar, which nobody was really doing in England at the time. And so he was a big deal, and got involved with Alexis Corner's band, and then eventually hooked up with Keith and Mick. And of course, the story. Eventually, he's outed as the leader of the band, but initially, yeah, very, very important because they were all like, there's this. Somebody said something like every British band that started in the '60s were London bands were cover bands. They were blues cover bands, and that's pretty much true. So he was like, and because the Stones were doing it, they influenced so many people.
He did not want to abandon the blues sound. That was the major difference, the creative difference.
Yeah, I think there was also just, Keith and Mick were writing songs, and he really wasn't, and they became the creative force. So it has to be difficult if you're the guy, which he was early on in the Stones, and then all of a sudden now you're sort of just the guitar player now. And I think that was difficult. And, the trappings of fame and drugs, and he got kind of really messed himself up. It's tragic. I mean, a very talented guy, but it's a shame.
Let's talk about the Yardbirds. You described them as an eclectic mix of art and grammar school kids. They're also credited as the first band to improvise. They were a jam band before there was a thing called jam bands.
Yeah, and I point this out in the book, that Yardbirds do get that credit, but it's not entirely true. They were people. The Yardbirds got famous because of Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page. Certainly here in America. And so people, oh yeah, they're the first band to improvise. But there are a lot of other bands that were doing that at the same time or even before. Bands like the Animals and Manfred Mann were improvising. But I think the Yardbirds, because they had such talent at the guitar position, that they were expanding songs often by necessity, because they had to fill up, 2-hour set, and they only had, 45 minutes of music. So they would just kind of do solos and jam, like you said. And but that was influential. And I think also because there was just such talent in that band. And I think Paul Samuel Smith doesn't get enough credit as well as the bass player. Bass players generally don't anyway. But in the Yardbirds, they're just so inventive in his bass lines. I think one of the things cool that I think about the Yardbirds that really strikes me more than the improvisational aspect is that they tore apart these songs. They were like, everybody else was like, let's try to do it. Let's try to be like, stay true to what the original artist did. And they're like, nah, we're not black. We're not American. Let's just do it, and let's just rock it out. And I think that really had an impact on people too. And then eventually the Yardbirds kind of went their own way with psychedelia and stuff when Jeff Beck took over.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this.
You know, when I got back from Vietnam, I didn't have a lot going for me. No friends, no home, and a town full of cops giving me shit. The only thing that got me through was the Sean Geek podcast, which I download off of SeanMcGinnity.ca. And so should you. That's the Sean Geek podcast, which you can download from SeanMcGinnity.ca. Do it, or the first blood's going to be yours.
We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. The Animals, I know Eric Burdon had grown tired of singing House of the Rising Sun in later years, but it's such an important milestone in British rock history and classic rock history. The first British Invasion #1 not connected to the Beatles, a huge hit. And as you so accurately put it in the book, a song that is epic in every sense of the word.
It's funny. I'll talk about that in a second. I was just thinking about I saw a video of the Animals performing "We've Got to Get Out of This Place" on Ed Sullivan in like 1964 or something like that. And they, and if we're watching, they're all wearing suits and they're all playing, and it's just cool. But the generations, they show the audience, and these older people are like aghast. What is this crap? And I could just, and we don't even think about that anymore because nobody gets offended by anything. We don't get offended when we hear, like, I don't know, parents hear their kids are listening to hip hop. They don't care, But back then, like my parents' generation, that was just, you couldn't listen to that. It was terrible. It was awful music. And, but yeah, getting back to House of the Rising Sun, I mean, an old song, a traditional song that they made it their own, which is a cool thing anyway. I always love that, like how Hendrix made All Along the Watchtower his song, obviously, Bob Dylan's song, of course, but he made it his. And so, and they took that song and changed it in such a way that the opening, the way that Hilton Valentine plays the opening, and I mentioned that he took that from Paul Anka's song called Diana, and there was a little resistance in the band to that, but they eventually went along with it, and so it made it really distinctive. Eric Burdon's vocals, and then the fact that it was a 4-minute song. Like nowadays, so, but back then it was like, no, it has to be 2.5, 3 minutes is pushing it, and it was Mickey Most, their manager, was just like, yeah. It was just like something about, let's just do it. And the BBC wouldn't play it for a while, but eventually it became a hit without the BBC, and they finally relented, and it changed everything. It was like one step and sort of saying, okay, we can do that. We can do longer songs, and we can, and of course everything's bouncing off, but London's not in a vacuum. Stuff's going on in New York, San Francisco, and Memphis and whatnot, and everybody's like experimenting.
And that song still to this day, somebody hearing it for the first time, they're affected by it when they hear it. It hasn't lost anything to time. That will go on long past our time. There'll be people discovering that song in 30 years, 40 years. It's such a powerful song.
Yeah, and I think and we were talking about earlier that, they grew up, especially those guys, the Animals grew up in Newcastle, which it's funny because I did so many interviews that I now I'm not an expert by any means, but I can kind of detect where people are from when they were from England. And you can tell, you can hear a hint of a Scottish accent, but it was a really rough fishing town back then. And so I think that's reflected in the performance. Eric Burdon's vocals. He doesn't sound like a 20-year-old kid, when he's singing. He sounds like an older man that's seen a lot of things, and that comes through in that song.
Let's talk about The Who next. You write, quote, in 1965, The Who inherited the London mantle left in the wake of the popularity of bands like the Stones and the Yardbirds. I have a friend who feels that original lineup, Roger Daltrey, Pete Townsend, Keith Moon, John Entwistle, is the most talented lineup in rock history, from their proficiency on their individual instruments, Roger's voice, the songwriting abilities of Townsend. I guess it's hard to argue that.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue that. I mean, I let's say I might go Led Zeppelin, but you just can't disrespect the Who. Those guys were ridiculous, all of them, like you said, and somehow they function together, even though they're like we're like 4 ex-spouses playing in the same band,
right?
But that energy, and I think that anger fueled. And this creativity in Pete Townsend's mind, just as an aside, I'm like an amateur guitar player, and I was working on 2112s, trying to learn that from Rush, and I'm playing this acoustic part, and I'm like, that's Pete Townsend. He had to be listening to The Who when he wrote this, you
Wow,
know?
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not like he's not copying them, but he's using these same sort of chip chords up and down the neck that Pete Townsend uses, and yeah, I mean, there's nothing really you can't say about the Who. I mean, they did everything, you know, they crossed everything.
They influenced artists musically, but how about their on-stage presence? I mean, they pushed that forward and influenced so many of the bands that you would see after them on stage. Pete Townsend smashing the guitar, the always unpredictable Keith Moon, Roger swinging the mic.
Right, yeah, and they would just kind of, you know, okay, and they're always restless. What's the next thing we're going to do? We're not going to, like the Beatles were, we're not going to make the same record that we just made. So, you know, the Who were just kind of continuing to advance, and we're like, okay, we're going to do this weird concept song called like Quick One While He's Away, and that's going to eventually lead to Tommy, and then, you know, and the Lifehouse Project, which ended up as Who's Next, of course, Quadrophenia and stuff. But yeah, the creativity in the Who is it's just so inspired. I don't hear anybody quite like that.
They talked about the Beatles being the good boys, always smiling, happy, dressed nice, and the Stones were the bad boys. The Who were the wild and unpredictable band.
Again, I talk about this. I think it might just be a note in the book where I kind of correct that a little bit with the Beatles and the Stones. It was the opposite, you know. And in fact, I think what was it? The Lemmy from Motorhead talked about this before he died. That you didn't mess with the Beatles. They were from Liverpool, you know,
Yeah.
and especially back then, that was a rough poor town. They cut their teeth in Hamburg in Germany, another rough poor town. The Stones were middle class kids. That was the image. They were the bad boys. The Beatles were the good guys, but the reality was just the opposite.
Sure. Yeah, the media played up the reverse image.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't know. The Who were just, I don't know if we compare them in that aspect. I mean, you know, Roger was more of the, you know, the working class guy, and Pete was more the middle class guy. And they certainly had that ferocity on stage. I think, you know, of all of them, you wouldn't want to mess with Roger. You know, he just wouldn't mess with him. And Keith was just insane. He just, you know, because he was just what he was. And certainly don't try to outdrink him, that's for sure.
A rival band of the Who was the Small Faces.
Right.
Now, they were writing hits early on, but as you quote the late, great Small Faces singer Steve Marriott, this was to make a name for themselves. After that, then they started to stretch out.
Yeah, and I think some of those bands got that if they wanted to weigh in, they had to kind of have hits or do what was kind of going on at that time. And then once they got into that and were able to make records, then and sell records, then they could have some freedom. And Steve Marriott was pretty restless early on, and he wanted to do that, and he understood though that that's what you had to do. So he did it, and eventually the Ogden's Not Gone Flake record, that classic record, you know. So they were able to do, you know, which is this weird psychedelic concept album that they did, would lead to that.
Boy, I love Steve Marriott's work with Humble Pie.
Oh, yeah, me too.
There was talk that he would have taken over Bon Scott's role in AC/DC after Bon passed away.
I never knew that, but that would have been, instead of Brian Johnson taking over AC/DC. Wow. That's it. Yeah, that would have been interesting because they got so huge, you know, of course, with the Back in Black record, Brian Johnson on vocals. What would Steve Marriott have been like?
The Stones start to really break out creatively by 1965. July of 65, I Can't Get No Satisfaction released. And much like House of the Rising Sun, a huge moment in UK rock history and classic rock. The innovation of the guitar, how it was recorded, the lyrics are the kind of lyrics that fall right in line with the image of, as we just mentioned, the bad boy Stones. And
right.
Talk about Keith's guitar work and that distorted guitar sound. How he was able to get that.
Yeah, it's like they're all experimenting. He's like, well, can we use like distortion as an instrument, you know, and to kind of mimic like a trumpet or something, you know, and so it was really nobody had really done that in rock and roll. Like nowadays, again, we look back and you're satisfied, good song, you know, maybe a little edgy for the time. You don't think anything of it, but just the way it was recorded and the you know, the use of distortion as an instrument was completely different, and so people are experimenting. Of course, like, you know, the Who and the Kinks are experimenting with feedback as an instrument, So yeah, I think that's what really struck me about the whole era. It was what, what can we do? What hasn't been done and what can we do? It was all open, and, and audiences were open to it. So it was like the perfect storm, so to speak. Right. So, I believe this, that I think to be a great artist, to really be an artist, you have to be selfish. I think you have to create for yourself. And if you're just creating for other people, it's all commerce. Well, those people at the time, they were creating for themselves, but there was also people that were, hey, cool. And of course, it's starting with the Beatles, what's the Beatles did that? Wow. And then that influenced not just, obviously the fans are into it, but the musicians were, wait a minute, they used a sitar? They did what? An orchestra? What's this Mellotron thing? Like anything was up for grabs.
And Dave Davies, you just mentioned the Kinks. He's one of those guys, the innovative guitarist, Dave Davies. He talked in the book about you would hear a sound in his head, experiment with the guitar, see if you can capture that sound that you hear in your head. And again, that goes back to what you're saying. It's got to be, it's not a selfish thing, but it's got to come from inside, and it more often than not connected with the audience.
Yeah, and I think what I mean by, I don't even mean selfish in a bad way.
Right.
If it's possible, it's more of like
honest. It's got to be real. It's got to be.
Yeah. This is what I think this is. Yeah, I got this sound in my head, and let's see what we can do. Can we create something that sounds like that? And so he does this song called "See My Friend" that has this weird sitar-y sound, even though it's not a sitar. And they had limited technology back then, so you couldn't just make stuff happen with your PC Pro Tools or something like that. And so you had to be creative in how you did it, slicing the amplifier, speakers, the woofer speakers, to get that muddy sound on You Really Got Me, and things like that. And so, yeah, what I mean by selfish, I guess, to soften that a little bit, is that it was more, man, what can we do that we like, and it wasn't driven by what do we think that the audience is going to like. It's what do we want to do that we haven't done before, and the audiences were like, cool, that's they're along for the ride.
Absolutely. And we haven't gotten to the folk aspect of the London scene. That's another area you get into in the book. There were quite a few folk venues that began popping up all over Britain, and from those venues came future legends, and the influence would show prominently in future Led Zeppelin recordings. Robert Plant, hugely influenced by folk, and he continues to make music. His music is still rooted in folk. I just saw a story that he and Alison Krauss will release another folk rock album. Talk about the folk rock scene in London.
There was, in the 50s and 60s especially, there was a network of folk club scenes throughout the UK, folk clubs, and they were very, very low. There was basically a room in a pub. There was no PA, no stage a lot of times. There were exceptions. The Les Cousins in London was a little bit more upscale than that. Not much. But basically it was a parallel scene to the rock and blues scene going on. And if you talk to the musicians, it's funny because they're like, they didn't cross over at all. They're very insistent, but it kind of did. And not formally. It wasn't like, punk and metal sort of made grunge in a way in Seattle in the 80s and 90s. It was it was kind of like more of a filtering from the folk scene, and like, maybe like a Jimmy Page would catch a Burt Jansch concert or something, or the Pentangle, and he'd be like, man, that's really cool what he's doing. And then he'd do a song like Black Mountainside, which is on Led Zeppelin 1. But Led Zeppelin was really influenced by that folk music scene, and then bands came out of that, of course, like Fairport Convention and the Strawbs that came out of that as well, and other artists like Al Stewart and stuff came out of that. So, but it sounded like a really cool time, even from that standpoint. If you were in the folk scene, you could just make a nice living, not make a lot of money, but you could make a lot, you could do well and travel and sleep people's houses and go to folk clubs and play and just have a good time doing it. So, but yeah, that really was, and they started to really tap into these old, hundreds of year old traditional songs. I mean, the Traffic cover of, when John Barleycorn Must Die goes back to like 1588 or something like that. And they were like, what traditions do we have? We looked into American traditions, the blues, what do we have? And it gets integrated into all kinds of different, what we now call classic rock bands.
And Sandy Denny, that's an artist you do devote some time to in the book. She was the singer of that folk band, Fairport Convention, the Strawbs. Before that, you mentioned them. Sandy and Fairport Convention, you write, created and defined British folk rock. Sandy's life ended too soon. Sad. She was only 31 when she died. She is a part of Led Zeppelin history. She's on the song The Battle of Evermore from Led Zeppelin 4.
Yeah, and I do want to give a shout out to Fairport Convention's first singer, Judy Dybel, who actually recently passed away. She was on the first album. And she actually talked to my students a couple of times. Just a real sweet lady. So wow. Really sad to lose her. But she left the band after the first album, and then Sandy Denny was brought in. And she also, of course, came from the folk. She was a folk singer, and but the voice is just. Listen to Fotheringay, or who knows where the time goes, and it's just like, well, if you're not affected by that, like I mentioned in the book, there's just something wrong with you. It's not just beautiful; it's just I can't even describe it. I can't just bring it into words. It's just it's beyond beautiful. It's just deep and pure, and her personality was completely different than what you'd think she might be, as I mentioned in the book. But yeah, she was enormous, and because. Led Zeppelin were huge Fairport Convention fans, and she is the only guest vocalist on any Led Zeppelin album. Of course, as you mentioned, on the Battle of Evermore, and so I hear her and Robert Plant going at it and kind of like singing past each other. That is funny because when I first heard Led Zeppelin 4, and I don't know how old I was, teenager, and I put it on, I'm like, yes, Stairway to Heaven. I heard that a million times. I heard Black Dog, I heard Rock and Roll a million times. And then what's this song, Battle of Evermore? It's never been on the radio. Who is this Sandy Denny? And it's just wow. So yeah, she was amazing.
Born in London, it says here, Merton Park, London. Yeah, born 1947, died April 21st, 1978. The late great Sandy Denny. But yeah, people should definitely go check out the Fairport Convention music and the Strawbs. Eric Clapton was a member of the Yardbirds, famously left. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to interject the Pentangle. Don't forget about them. People that are interested in any of that sort of folky, they kind of crossed a lot of things. They weren't just traditional folk. They did like bluesy stuff, but a very quiet band. And as I talked to, I think it was, I guess it was Terry Cox, drummer. And we talked about, I said, you're quiet, but not boring. It keeps your interest because first of all, you got John Renburn and Bert Jansch on guitars, acoustic guitars. What's not to like, And but I think they were a band that people should, if you're interested in that sort of thing, definitely check them out.
I definitely need to check them out. Pentangle, Fairport Convention, and the Strawbs. Eric Clapton, member of the Yardbirds, but famously left when they had a pop hit, For Your Love. He felt that they abandoned their blues roots, and soon after we have Cream, Clapton, Jack
Right.
Bruce, Ginger Baker.
Right.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on Eric Clapton's influence. He felt uncomfortable with that label of God. He preferred the bluesmen before him get the credit, not him, since they were the ones who influenced him.
Yeah, and I think that he's taken lately, especially like I mentioned with the anti-vaxxer thing, some abuse, some of it deserved. But I think that he was always indebted to those people, to the blues people, and always gave credit. And I mentioned B.B. King, Robert Johnson. He did a record of all Robert Johnson covers in 2004 or something like that. Always indebted to those people. So he really, I mean, he's a great player, but I think he understood where it came from, and I think that was one thing that was really admirable. I think what I really appreciated is the fact that he desperately, and that's Clapton we're talking about, tried to show Americans, hey, look at these artists that you have. You see that with the Stones, you see it with Led Zeppelin too, and it just, Americans didn't really, to some extent, I guess, but not as much as they should, really latch onto that.
Well, I credit Clapton with learning about Robert Johnson. It was through him that made me want to know more about this guy.
Yeah.
The chapter Prog Rock gets into the Beatles' seminal album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967. You write that after the release of this album, it seemed anything was up for grabs.
Yeah, it's almost like you could feel that the Beatles are carrying the torch, right, up until Sgt. Pepper's. And then, Brian Epstein, their manager, dies shortly after that. And they the Beatles they're a little bit of disarray. They're still hugely popular. Everything they do is really popular. But you get the feeling that they dropped the ball off at Sgt. Pepper and said, look, this is it. You folks now, you figure out, you do it. and everybody was like, that record, and it was just so outrageous, that people were running with it, and what else can we do? And yeah, it certainly continued to drive people to new heights and see whatever they could do.
More often than not, it's ranked as the greatest rock album of all time.
It's funny because it was for a long time, but that's no longer. If you notice, that's not the hip Beatles album to like anymore. Now it's either Revolver or the White Album.
Yeah, Revolver or the White Album. Yeah. Revolver is now considered the first classic rock album.
Yeah, and which is cool. My favorite Beatles album is Abbey Road. I mean, which was their last actual real statement in the studio. But that's not the hip album to like either. It's got to be Revolver and or the White Album. But certainly Sgt. Pepper's was a landmark. Nobody was so out there, and nobody had done anything like that.
The experimentation with sounds, things you could do in the studio. The progressive rock bands like Jethro Tull, Yes, King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, often with the connotation that's not always favorable. In your words, you feel prog rock deserves so much more than that portrayal. I agree. Why do you feel that way?
I think it's because people wanted to do something different, and prog rock isn't for everybody. Of course, because I play for my students to listen to it, and sometimes they get bored with it because you have to let it sort of come to you, right? It might take a while, and there may or may not be a payoff. And but I think that just the fact that people were just trying to take things to the limit. What can we do? Every one of them did it. Every one of them's been stretched. Yes, and Paul, let's do a whole album as one song, like Thick as a Brick. And who was doing that? You know what I mean? And again, whether you like it or not, I think it may be a bit of an acquired taste, but I really think that those bands, and in a lot of ways, prog rock really never went out of style. There's still a ton of prog rock bands out there. Maybe not as popular as they were in their heyday, but yeah, I think it definitely, it's sort of like the music media love to pile on about prog rock, and they never really stop.
Yeah, I just think it's unfair. I don't know what it is that they have. Like if you look at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they look at it as these guys take themselves too seriously. Maybe it's pretentious. I don't know, but it's all good. It's all rock and roll. It's experimenting. Right. It's doing whatever. It's trying to push things beyond where they found them. I don't see what the problem is there, but
yeah, I don't know either. I mean, certainly, it was like the way the history is written, right? Punk rock came along and kind of tore off, this destroyed punk rock or prog rock, and it brought back rock and roll back to its roots. And I don't think that's what happened at all. And I think it just, we don't want to do that. We want to do something. We want to strip things down and kind of do a reaction to that, which is cool. And I think it's just like, okay, great. Why can't you like the Ramones and still like Yes? What's the difference? It's just like they're completely different kinds of music for different moods. And so, I've always thought it was unfair that prog rock was attacked as being pretentious. I'm like, well, because they're doing something, experimenting. I don't know. I mean, it's punk rock can be pretentious too and hypocritical. So, I think it's not really fair for people that lived through it, especially people that, let's say, got into punk rock. You had to reject that. You had to reject like the Beatles and the Stones and the prog rock bands, and you had to only listen to punk rock. And you're kids. So, but now it's kind of silly. I think it's like, you can, I love the first Clash album as an example, but I also want to hear, sometimes I'm into Tull. So it's all good, like you said.
Well, Pink Floyd, they're in my top 5, and their story is so interesting. They start out as a blues outfit in the mid-'60s, even name themselves after 2 bluesmen, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council. But from there, it's a long and winding journey through experimentations with instruments, with sounds, with song structures, and as we know, with drugs. Can you talk about Pink Floyd's influence, particularly those early years with Syd Barrett?
Well, like you said, I mean, basically they all started in the blues. That was the base. And as Pink Floyd was like a lot of other bands, but they were kind of discovering the more artsy side of things, and Syd Barrett was their visionary. And certainly they were the lead. British psychedelia wasn't as prominent as maybe some people think. It wasn't, obviously psychedelia really mostly originated in the West Coast of the U.S. But Floyd and bands like them, and even the Move didn't even want to be labeled as psychedelic, but the Floyd was pretty much paving the way. I think like if you look at psychedelia, it's really just more like about a journey accompanied by music, really. Whether you're tripping or not, with acid, or you're just part of the light show and the feeling of the music, and very jammy kind of music. And certainly early on they were like that, very jammy and psychedelic, not at all like Dark Side of the Moon when in the David Gilmour era.
Do you prefer the Syd Barrett era over the post Syd Barrett era?
I kind of like them just before sort of the transitional era, in the metal era.
I was going to say metal and Obscured by Clouds, and you could see that transition. It wasn't immediate, and in those days, the labels could give them some time. I don't know if they could. Yeah, I don't think that could happen nowadays.
No, and they kind of had time to because people were interested in letting the bands do what they wanted to do, and people meaning the fans, and they were buying the records, they were going to shows. And I mentioned in the book that you could go to a show with a bunch of different bands on the bill that had nothing to do with each other. It wasn't like now where the opening act has to be in the same genre or whatever, right? Or there's going to be a rebellion, or they're going to get booed off stage or something. Everybody was open to that. So the bands had time to sort of find themselves, certainly more than they did later on.
I want to get into the early days of Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green. I can't leave this band out because I love that early era. Although I have to admit, like many, I discovered Fleetwood Mac during the Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham era when they had all the hits. And then you go back and you realize again, much like Pink Floyd, much different band than they were in later years. And Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green, that's a distinct sound that has influenced many of the classic rock musicians that came after. Could you talk about his importance, Peter Green's importance to the generations that followed?
The Fleetwood Mac rather is such a fascinating band because there basically were three bands, right? There's the Peter Green era, the Bob Welch era, and then of course the Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham era, which ultimately became by far the most popular. It's funny because I guess it's now maybe 2-3 years ago. My wife wanted to see, Rick Springfield, Jesse's Girl.
Yeah.
Rick Springfield. She wanted to go see him. And he was playing at a local theater, and I wasn't really into it. But I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll be your backup plan. If you can't get somebody, I'll go with you." So I ended up going because she couldn't find anybody to go with, and I loved it. I had no idea he was as good as a guitar player. He was ridiculously good. But at one point, he was talking about he says, I used to cover this song back in the '60s, and it's called "Oh Well," which is Peter Green, Fleetwood Mac. And he killed it, and I'm into it. I'm like, yes, and I'm just like bopping my head. I'm so into it, and I'm looking around the audience, and they're all like my age, right? They're all like, this isn't Jesse's Girl.
That's so fun. Did they know the song, or did it look like they just had no clue?
They just were like, what is this?
Yeah, his audience probably didn't.
No, and I was probably the only person in the audience that was like, yes, because it was, and he just did it by himself on acoustic guitar, by the way, which is ridiculous. But
one of the greatest riffs in blues rock history, really.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
A great tone, and I remember Tom Petty, when he came out with his album Mojo in 2010, and the article in Rolling Stone, they interviewed Mike Campbell, Tom Petty's guitarist, and he said he was going for that Fleetwood Mac, Peter Green tone.
I think Mike Campbell is a great example of a guitar player that's really good, but doesn't feel the need to show it off all the time. It's like he's a slave to the song. The song needs it. Yeah, if it doesn't, he's not. And I think that in a lot of ways was like Peter Green, because Peter Green also understood the concept of space. He didn't have to be, not knocking Eddie Van Halen, because I was a huge Van Halen fan and was very upset when he died. But like all that kind of stuff. And it was like, that doesn't necessarily mean greatness, although he was great. But I mean, you could play slow and let the song breathe, that whole Miles Davis thing. And so I think that really influences people like Mike Campbell.
Yeah, Peter Green, I want to say he lived just up until, did he just pass away? Yeah, he just passed away.
A year
Yeah.
ago or something. Yeah, something like that. It's also, you think about those two guys, Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, of course, the band's named after them, Fleetwood Mac, had very little to do with the direction of the band, but they were the original guys, and they were the only ones that were all the way through. But yeah, he talks about Peter Green and just how, well, he doesn't play like a speed demon, but and then you start to appreciate what he's really doing. And one of the few people that, B.B. King was like, he gave him the chills. Like, like B.B. King said that. And so yeah, he was, just super influential. And I think in the right way. I think that, I always appreciated guitar players and, Pete Townsend too, even like Jimmy Page, even though Jimmy Page could do all that stuff. Like it's only if it's necessary. You know what I mean? Like if the song doesn't call for it, you don't need to show off your chops every time, every song.
How about Judas Priest covering the Green Manalishi? That was a Fleetwood Mac, Peter Green era song. Did you know that Judas Priest covered that?
No, I had no idea.
Yeah. And another one that I would say recommended listening, Albatross. Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green, Albatross. A beautiful instrumental. And Black Magic Woman was another one. Santana made it famous, but that was Peter Green era Fleetwood Mac. As you say it yourself in the epilogue, London in the 1960s, anything could happen, and it did. And we are all better for it.
Yeah, it was it's timeless, that music. It's still, I can't tell you how many times, I teach college, as I mentioned, and I got 20-year-olds walking around with Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones, Beatles shirts. Of course, Beatles weren't from London, but still that era was just, it's still, there's always people making great music, but there was such an intensity back then, and it's still with us.
London Reign Over Me, How England's Capital Built Classic Rock. Now, that was made available through Roman and Littlefield on the 15th of July in paperback, correct?
Right.
It was released in February of 2020 in both hardcover and Kindle, but now you can get it in paperback, and it's available pretty much wherever books are sold. But if you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there. Support not just the author, but your local independent bookstore. And a link to find your nearest bookstore on our show notes page. Any other sites you want to direct people to get a copy of this, Stephen? Or do you have your own website you want people to check out?
Yeah, they can check out my website. It's just Stephen Tow, StephenTow.com. And I have to update it now that we're actually started to do more. Things are sort of opening up, and now they're closing again. We'll see if we can get some more readings and stuff in there.
Well, we'll definitely urge people to go to your website, stay up to date. Stephen, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks to Stephen Tow for taking us through his book, London Reign Over Me, How England's Capital Built Classic Rock. Subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.